I call tonight's hearing to order. All right, I call tonight's hearing to order. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Arva Rice. I'm President and CEO of the New York Urban League. I want to thank Wagner College President Dr. Jeffrey Doggett, Caitlin Miller, and their staff for hosting us this evening. Tonight, we will begin our final round of public hearings taking place in all 5 boroughs. These hearings have furthered our efforts to solicit proposals from policy experts and the public on substantial, effective amendments to the city charter. The charter is our city's foundation document. Because the charter plays a vital role in establishing the structure and procedures of city government, it shapes how decisions are made on a wide range of issues affecting everyday New Yorkers. This commission has been empaneled to conduct a thorough review of the charter and craft proposals to put before the voters. This is our chance to create a better functioning city, one that is more transparent in its activities and more accountable to the people. It is an opportunity to make changes to ensure our city is less vulnerable to manipulation, corruption, or fraud. I know that all of my colleagues take this responsibility very seriously. While this commission was envisioned via local law passed by the City Council, we are an independent body. Regardless of the merits, any proposal that can be achieved by local law will likely not be up for our consideration. The commission will not consider any proposals that weaken local democracy or New Yorkers' rights. Following our second round of hearings, the commission staff produced an updated set of recommendations for the commission. These recommendations focus on 3 policy areas: government accountability, budget transparency, and land use. Our final round of hearings also concentrates on these areas, with each hearing covering one area. Tonight, we will hear testimony on government accountability. Some final notes on the process. We are not the commission reviewing the charter. The commission is distinct from the Charter Revision Commission convened by the mayor. Both commissions are working simultaneously, but separately. Last week, the New York State Assembly and Senate passed legislation that would prevent mayoral proposals from bumping any other charter amendments from the ballot. Pending the governor's signature, our proposals could appear on the November ballot alongside those of the mayor's commission. Harry Isaiah Black is joining us today as counsel. I'd like to ask the members of the commission to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Commissioner Longley.
Good evening, Staten Island. Happy to be here. My name is Serena Longley. I'm appointed by New York City Council Speaker Adrienne Adams. Thank you.
Rachel Goodman, Chief of Staff to the New York City Comptroller and appointed by the Comptroller.
Joanne Yu, appointed by the Speaker.
And we have a few that are also joining us online. My apologies, I cannot see that small print. Can you call them for me?
Commissioner Coppell.
Hi, I'm Andrea Coppell, an appointee of City Council Speaker Adams.
Commissioner Swisher.
Good evening. This is Alan Swisher. I am an appointee by Queensborough President Donovan Richards.
Commissioner Agarwal.
Good evening. Rahul Agarwal, appointed by New York City Mayor Eric Adams.
Commissioner Raju.
Commissioner Raju, you were on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Dr. Ram Raju, appointed by the Staten Island Borough President.
And Commissioner Miraglia.
We'll come back and let him introduce himself. I know he was on screen and then we lost him. Oh, here's back. No, we lost him. Okay.
Good evening. Sorry about that. Robert Miraglia for the Bronx Borough President. Thanks so much.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We'll now turn to the testimony portion of tonight's agenda, which will focus on government accountability. As the commission staff indicated in its updated recommendations, increasing government accountability could strengthen New York's local democracy in several ways. This includes securing the independence of oversight agencies by establishing baseline investments and making other structural enhancements, subjecting additional commissioners and senior officials to advice and consent, establishing an additional means of removing a mayor, increasing transparency whenever the mayor uses their emergency powers, and authorizing the city council to submit local laws subject to mandatory referendums at special elections. Today, the charter contains an array of mechanisms and independent agencies designed to ensure city officials are responsive to the people they serve. Yet structural risks remain, preventing those features from working as designed. The Commission is therefore interested in hearing more tonight about how we can update the charter to promote good governance. Before hearing testimony, I remind those in attendance that this is a formal government procedure and that decorum must always be observed. As such, audience members shall remain silent at all times. If you intend to testify today but have not registered to do so, we will accept registrations up to the first 30 minutes of tonight's hearings. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. Video recordings or photography is not allowed from the witness table. At tonight's hearing, we will ask folks to limit their testimony to 3 minutes. I will let you know when your time is up. While tonight's hearing focuses on government accountability, we welcome any testimony on proposed revisions to the charter. Finally, I ask that our witnesses and commissioners speak directly into their mics so that our Zoom attendees can clearly hear you. We're going to ask to, I'm going to introduce the first person to give their testimony, and that is Michael Aveniter.
Right into the mic. Good evening. Welcome to Widener College, U.S. News and World Report's most beautiful campus. Take a minute to walk around. And welcome to Staten Island. I am testifying on behalf of Councilmember Camilla Hanks this evening. I have the honor and privilege of serving as her senior advisor. She represents the North Shore. You're currently in her district. And I appreciate the opportunity this evening to talk to you. Councilwoman Hanks has long championed transparency, equity, and government accountability, particularly when it comes to interagency dysfunction, resiliency planning, and delivering infrastructure that actually meets the needs of our community. On her behalf, I wanted to speak plainly about what we're seeing on the ground and what structural reforms we believe are necessary to restore public trust in city governance. Let me start with an issue that illustrates Staten Island's unique struggle with overlapping jurisdictions and accountability, our waterfront. Councilmember Hanks has helped lead a historic generational $426 million investment in the North Shore waterfront. An unprecedented initiative will deliver a 2.2-mile continuous esplanade with fish cleaning stations and boat launches and kayak rentals, 3,000 units of new housing, 1,000 units of which are affordable workforce housing, a new school, et cetera, et cetera. State-of-the-art recreation center to replace the one that was destroyed during Hurricane Sandy. This is a bold, transformative vision, and yet what's standing in the way of its full realization is not funding or community support, but the government itself. Multiple agencies at the federal, state, and city level, each with overlapping jurisdictions, have created a bureaucratic knot that slows the progress and drains the momentum. From the Army Corps of Engineers to the city's own Department of Design and Construction, we're navigating silos instead of solutions. That's why Councilmember Hanks is calling on the creation of the Permanent Office of the Waterfront, a centralized body that can coordinate across agencies and cut through red tape. Staten Island should not have to wait another generation to get their public waterfront access, resiliency upgrades, and housings that our residents deserve. So that's just a for instance. She's actually introduced legislation to that effect, but it would be so much simpler if you guys just did it. We also urge the Commission to pursue the following reforms for these recommendations. There's an Office of Housing Recovery. We wish to see that eliminated. It was created after Superstorm Sandy, but it's long outlived its necessity. Instead of offering a comprehensive vision for how flood-prone communities can adapt to climate change, the office has mostly focused almost exclusively on elevating homes, often to an unsafe or unreasonable height. Imagine walking out 28 steps just to throw your garbage out. In areas like Staten Island's Midland Beach and Ocean Breeze, the city refused to participate in the state buyout program and forced its residents to remain in vulnerable homes while the flood insurance costs soared. The office has been a bureaucratic failure. Any limited functions it still performs can be consolidated within the newly established Office of the Waterfront or the Office of Emergency Management, where it'll be more effectively and equitably carried out. We'd also like to see the petition threshold for municipal races raised back up to pre-pandemic levels to ensure significant challenges have sustained broad-based support. Change will also save the city millions in public matching funds through the campaign finance system that currently go to candidates that are simply not viable. These resources should be directed towards increasing civic participation, supporting competitive, serious candidates, not subsidizing vanity runs or performative filings that flood the ballot and confuse voters. Here on Staten Island, we know a little too well what happens when our local voices are overridden. Without the shield of member deference and local zoning, we risk becoming flooded with projects and regulations that simply do not fit the character, infrastructure, or aspirations of our neighborhoods. Staten Island has always been treated like a dumping ground, sometimes literally. Tuberculosis patients citywide, send them to Staten Island. Mentally ill New Yorkers with no support systems, they go to Staten Island. Garbage from the other boroughs, floated here. Today's latest example of the new Fresh Kills landfill is battery energy storage systems, often cited without adequate community engagement or consideration for local input. Preventing council members from protecting their districts from projects that simply don't belong, regardless of what the administration may want them, is unacceptable. We must maintain land use checks that allow council members to reflect and protect the needs of the people they were elected to represent. Empowering what we call sub-government, sort of imagine a federalization of New York City, so boroughs as states. New York City is often described not as one city, but as a collection of neighborhoods, and we couldn't agree more. While we're one unified city, we're also 5 different very unique boroughs with distinct needs, priorities, identities. What works in Queens may not work in the Bronx. What fits in Manhattan's density and tax base doesn't align with the character of Staten Island. What we need is a more federalist approach, a model of borough sub-government that empowers local officials and borough commissioners with real authority, discretion, and dedicated funding streams. Councilmember Hanks believes it's time to give boroughs the ability to act without having to beg City Hall for every planter, every bus bulb, every pothole that they need to fill. For instance, the Commissioner of the Department of Transportation should receive a dedicated percentage of revenue generated from the speed and red light cameras. This revenue currently is being swept into the general fund. So you get a ticket on Staten Island for running a red light, and it could go to pay for a social worker in the Bronx or an after-school program in the Queens, which is okay. But shouldn't that go towards fixing our roads on Staten Island, making sure that pedestrians have safe bus bulges or pedestrian islands? Let's reinvest that into local sidewalk repair, safety infrastructure, bike improvements that directly benefit the neighborhoods being ticketed. The Borough Commissioner for the Department of Environmental Protection could be empowered to generate and retain revenues. We have 2 facilities that are on major thoroughfares that are in C4 zoning that could put billboards up. The surrounding businesses have billboards that generate revenue, but the sewage treatment plant and the facility on Clove Road do not, even though they're surrounded by other businesses that do. If we could put up advertising revenue through billboards, the local commissioner could retain that from their facilities, and it could support gate and storm sewer cleanups, dredging of local ponds, ongoing maintenance of Staten Island's Blue Belt infrastructure. The Commissioner of Parks for our local borough should have an incentive to activate parks through concessions, rentals, and events. Currently, every dollar goes into the city general fund. Why not allow the commissioner to retain a portion of the concession revenue to reinvest in that borough? They could finish stalled projects, restore damaged trails, hire local staff. Borough commissioners could be allowed to set a borough appropriate rates for those concessions. Right now, we're offering parks facilities on Staten Island at commercial rents that make sense in Manhattan, but not here in Staten Island. No one's going to take a $100 square foot commercial property in Staten Island for anything. Empowering our boroughs with flexibility, funding, and accountability will bring government closer to the people that it actually serves. We just want to thank the commission for your commitment to this, to government accountability. Staten Islanders have long been told that to wait their turn for transit upgrades, storm recoveries, or housing investments for basic public safety resources. These delays are frustrating, and they push us in local government to be extremely frustrated with the centric approach. If we want to strengthen democracy, we need a government that delivers effectively, equitably, and with integrity. That requires reorganizing the diverse realities of our boroughs, recognizing the diverse realities of our boroughs, and giving local leaders the ability to solve problems at the street level. Thank you.
Thank you. We have been joined by two commissioners that I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves while we think about the recommendations that we heard in regards to the waterfront, the creation of the Office of the Waterfront Office, as well as some specific recommendations that we received about being able to utilize revenues rather than going into the general fund, being able for them to come back to the boroughs in some specific ways. But let's have our two commissioners introduce themselves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Navardo Lopez. I'm appointed by Speaker Adams and very happy to be here on Staten Island again.
Thank you.
And I'm Manny Pastrich, and I also had the honor of being appointed by Speaker Adams.
Terrific, thank you. So I'll ask the commissioners if they have any questions in regards to the proposals and recommendations that we've heard.
Thank you.
Hold on one moment, see if our commissioners have any questions of you. Any questions? I just had one question in regards to wanting to utilize some of the revenue that's generated. You specifically said some of the revenues that's received in regards to the traffic violations, having them come back to the borough. Do you have any specific ideas for how you would structure that?
So the DOT borough commissioner should have a fund that they can access. Right now, if you need to complete a project, be it redesigning an intersection or creating a pedestrian island, making a protected bike lane, a bus lane, DOT they have to go back to 55 Water, talk to the commissioner's office. If there was a dedicated fund, we're generating a lot of revenue with these red light cameras and speed cameras, which is unfortunate, but the revenue is there. If a portion of that was dedicated to fixing the roads, making them more pedestrian friendly, making them more driver friendly, maybe speeding up the transit system out here, I think Staten Islanders, while they still wouldn't like them, they might absorb that ability a little bit with a bigger smile on their face if they knew that it was going back to support their actual community instead of something that is esoteric. How do you talk to somebody about, well, that money's going to go to the general fund and maybe it'll come back around to you?
Understood. Okay. Any other questions from our commissioners who are online? All right. Thank you so much for your testimony. All right. Our next witness is Michelle Bashcom.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good.
Yes.
Thanks. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Michelle Bascom. I'm the Director of Programs and Development at Nonprofit Staten Island. We represent approximately 150 member organizations and the borough's nonprofit sector more broadly, which, as you know, deliver essential services to New Yorkers across the city every day. We deeply appreciate the work the Commission has been doing, and thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly as I can to 3 areas in your current recommendations that we believe are critical to our sector's ability to deliver on their essential services. These recommendations are pertaining to advice and consent, units of appropriation, and procurement reform. We strongly support extending the City Council's advice and consent role to include appointments specifically to the Procurement Policy Board and Office of Management and Budget. These entities wield tremendous influence over how and whether public dollars flow to organizations doing critical work on the ground. Community-based nonprofits, especially those in historically underfunded areas and boroughs, perhaps like Staten Island, cannot meaningfully partner with city government if procurement and budget practices lack transparency and democratic oversight. Staten Island nonprofits often grapple with delayed decisions on critical contracts, and we are optimistic that more democratic input to appointments to these oversight bodies like PPB and OMB will help ensure that the roles are filled with individuals who more deeply understand the needs, disparities, and implications of their decisions, specifically for underserved areas where services already lag. Involving City Council in these appointments, we believe, would bring broader accountability and serve as a step in the right direction to bringing the functionality of these entities in closer alignment with the needs of communities, help reduce bottlenecks, and ultimately improve equity in contracting and budgeting practices. Regarding units of appropriation, clarifying and subdividing units of appropriation as proposed will help public and service advocates better understand how city agencies allocate funds by program area. In our own fair share advocacy, as we call it, work, we've documented the ways in which opaque budget lines tend to obscure inequities in investment across boroughs and subpopulations. Smaller, clearer units would not only improve accountability, but also support intermediaries like ourselves in more strategic approaches and the city in more strategic and equitable planning. In our borough of concern is especially for youth, immigrant, and aging services, where disparities have emerged as particularly acute. Our fair share research shows that Staten Island consistently receives smaller per capita share of human services funding while suffering increasing need, particularly in the mentioned service areas. We believe that breaking down units of appropriation at a programmatic level would give nonprofits, intermediaries, and city council members the tools needed to track the ways that funding is truly being distributed, not only by agency, but by purpose and population served. This level of detail is essential to identifying funding gaps, aligning resources with actual community needs, and advocating effectively for under-resourced areas. With more transparent budget lines, we believe we can better assess equity across the boroughs, across the city, monitor outcomes tied to public investments, and support our council in making more informed and data-driven decisions. Finally, and thank you for your patience, we urge the Commission to move forward with recommendations to democratize the operation of PPB and hold oversight bodies like the Mayor's Office of Contracting Services accountable. Time and again, nonprofits are expected to deliver life-saving services under contracts that are delayed, underfunded, or modified without very clear justification. Reform here to us is beyond administrative. It is truly a matter of equity and community well-being. Delays in procurement and contracting stifle nonprofits borough-wide, but as I'm sure you've heard elsewhere, citywide. A recent comptroller report found that 90% of fiscal year 24 human services contracts were registered late. To us, this was a data point of what we know, the anecdotes we hear on a weekly basis, and what we have experienced ourselves. Just last week, we executed on a city contract for FY25, which we ourselves have undertaken work since July 1st, 2024. Notably, the Comptroller's Office has shared updated data just 6 weeks ago showing that over $1 billion in invoices are sitting in the procurement portal unpaid, with many having been delayed for over 200 days past the contract start date. Agencies who are funding a tremendous amount of programs and services for our most vulnerable communities, this includes Department for the Aging, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and Department of Youth and Community Development, have been found to generally issue payments over 1 year after a contract start date. These delays force nonprofits to take on debt or cut services. For Staten Island, where resources are already strained, as we heard a bit from the council member's office, this means that critical programs are at perpetual risk. Procurement reform, we believe, is a must. Oversight that demands accountability is quite past due and is beyond necessary. We believe that if charter reform is indeed an avenue for this, we encourage the recommendations to move forward. These 3 reforms, advice and consent for the key appointments, greater transparency in the budgeting processes, and stronger procurement oversight are deeply connected. Together, we trust that they would create the kind of governance ecosystem in which nonprofits can truly thrive and communities can be meaningfully closer to receiving a prompt and fair share of resources. I thank you for your consideration and again for the time tonight.
Thank you. Does any one of our commissioners have any questions or comments? Yep.
We are hearing a lot about the delay in payments, the whole procurement, the process. Just that's the universal story right now.
Yeah.
If there could, what do you think is the most urgent need, and if you if we gave you a magic wand to fix this, what would that one thing be?
It's a two-pronged one thing. It is catch up on your payments and ensure that the system then supports next year's payments. I think that there is something to be said for the current nasty phrase of government efficiency, but there is an inefficiency in the way of broken practice and technology. The Mayor's Office of Contracting Services, for example, recently overhauled their passport portal, which is the ways in which we all access and then manage our contracts and our payments. And the overhaul is not working. The overhaul has set us back a little bit, not to say that funds have not been released in this past fiscal year for the previous 2 or 3 fiscal years. The city needs to issue the payments that nonprofits are owed and reevaluate the reasons that they're not being issued. Yeah, we have heard, if it's helpful, anecdotally, and I referenced that we ourselves just executed a contract last week for this year's service work. There was a third party that was issuing that contract and paying us on behalf of a city agency, right? In our conversation with them, I had asked them, do you plan to issue this in the spring again next year? And their answer was, we look to the agency for the scope of work. When we receive that, we can pay you, which means to us that the city agency provided them the scope of work 6 months into the fiscal year. That's not the one agency's part, but it's symptomatic. And I think that the city needs to take this high level, which is why we encourage a charter approach here. If we think that there is a bird's level view that can bring accountability and streamline these practices, that ought to be implemented across agencies. Please.
So, we are hearing the need, now the urgent need, right? It's the increasing need for services, for information. Can you share what the nonprofits are telling you? How are they, if they're not getting paid, how are they paying their staff? I mean, how are they issuing a contract now when the fiscal year is going to be over in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, how are nonprofits, especially the smaller nonprofits, surviving for the fact that not everybody has a line of credit or has an endowment or has anything saved? Can you share a little bit of how are nonprofits managing?
Yeah, some do take on interest accruing debt. Some do tap into a line of credit, or they look to borrowers, or they look to intermediaries, like the Nonprofit Finance Fund, for example, which offers things like low interest, what they call bridge loans, to essentially bridge these gaps in funding times. So some do that. The particularly smaller orgs, the grassroots organizations, they simply function without funding, and they get their money when they can and do, and they deliver services because they deliver services. I would say mid-size, so 5 million to 15 million maybe, and then quite larger organizations, they float from last year's cash, right? They get paid in FY25 for FY24, so they use the FY24 money to pay for what they have to do, and then next year they realize revenue, and so the cycle goes. It's like carrying credit card debt, right? You pay it, and then when you can pay the bill, it opens up more credit, and then you do it again. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Glad that anyone reads our report on contracts.
We sure do.
Very gratifying. So one thing that my staff was talking about with the commission staff is just the notion of like a more democratic PPB. And obviously like all boards should have democratic operations. I don't know if you've ever been to a PPB meeting, but do you have a recommendation or a suggestion for what kind of language could be used to really drill down on how the PPB could better support the procurement process?
I think we'd be happy to submit something like that as a written testimony. I'm a language nerd. I'd want to look at it and reread it. And no, I have not been to one myself. So I think we would tap into our board members, our advocacy committee, and kind of solicit some further feedback, but put together a written testimony on that. And yeah, we would plus one the idea of democratizing it. I think, again, in writing my testimony for this evening, I drafted it as one step closer to, right? Because we recognize there's still ground level work to advocate to our council members to ensure that the needs really are being represented and uplifted in that role of advice and consent. But we're happy to learn more about it and work in partnership with the city to improve the functionality. Yeah.
Thank you for your testimony. And I agree, we've heard a lot of testimony from nonprofits and others that are trying to provide important services and seen delays like what you're describing. And I guess I just want to push you a little to say, like, goes to the, the commission takes the staff report, agrees on advice and consent, it passes. A little more specifically about why you think some of those problems may be solved because advice and consent was in place. Like, take it out of the conceptual and help me, like, why, what would be different, like a specific thing back and forth that would happen.
Yeah, admittedly for us, I think it is conceptual, right? I think we're not in the business of legalese and not as well read, but I would say that our reading and understanding is that increasing the role, our read and understanding is that increasing the role of a city council in essentially who is making those types of decisions, guiding that policy, sitting in those procurement meetings, as it were, and providing oversight in the way dollars roll out, better equips and empowers communities to work with our council people on what is appropriate, what voice they bring to the table. I think it's a representation matter, right? And again, maybe a genuine ignorance of the knowledge of the functionality in full of PPB, having not sat in those meetings. I don't know that we could speak to concretely what would be different. I think we believe that communities would have more voice. I think that we would put more trust in our council people to elevate the concerns. It wouldn't be one nonprofit by one nonprofit by one nonprofit telling our story of funding woes. It would be perhaps coalition building in partnership with our council members to say, you need to raise your voice in this setting, or you need to not consent to this appointment, or there need to be contingencies. And then we expect the political process to play out as it does. But one step closer to having voice at the table feels one step closer.
So can I just play devil's advocate?
By all means.
I mean, my fear is that you're basically taking a responsibility of the mayor, someone who's in charge and responsible.
Yep.
Now, the mayor is responsible for a lot of things, to your point, and putting two people having more responsibility, or two entities,
Bodies,
or
yeah.
two bodies, or your city council member and the mayor. And that's like, and trying to find the balance of how it makes it better when you have two bodies instead of one body that ultimately people hold responsible for these kinds of problems.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the political climate in Staten Island means we are no stranger to that argument, for sure. I think we would argue that there's a third alternative, right? I think that that is, in our minds, to some degree, what checks and balances is about. And if something cannot be reconciled or negotiated, it then warrants a third alternative. It's not something where we'd want to strip power off the executive per se, or frankly, over-empower our council people, right? Because they can do what they want to do when they get on the floor and quote unquote represent us. And so I think that our view is that it strikes more balance. It again kind of at least invites opportunity for community voice, and that if there is in fact a stalemate, it opens up avenues for negotiation, which we think could be a better outcome. Sometimes you win some and you lose some, and you take what is in the middle for the greater good. Thanks for asking.
This is a little bit more just adding to the discussion and less a question for the panelist. But, again, having talked to the folks on our team who do the procurement, like, there are very, very few individuals in the world who would consider themselves qualified to sit on the procurement policy board just because of the technical nature of it. So we don't have any objection to advice and consent, but I think I don't even know that the council members who would be questioning the witnesses or the potential appointees would even necessarily know what they're asking for. We do think that the vague notion of democratizing the board and allowing those commissioners, who are, by the way, appointed not just by the mayor, but by the controller and a couple other folks, to actually exercise their power, because as it is right now, like, it's very hard for them to bring motions and do other stuff like that. So just saying, as part of this dialogue, our procurement folks don't object to the notion of advice and consent, but don't really feel that that is what would make the most difference. So they think what would make more difference would be the members of the board actually being able to conduct their business in a more democratic way.
Thanks for sharing. I think we see that as part of what, kind of as I said, politics will play as they play out. I think that case can be made for quite a handful of things at the perhaps federal level even, of folks who engage in policy discourse without fully understanding the nuts and bolts of the technicalities. I think at all levels of government, such as the nature of democratizing representation.
Do the commissioners online have any questions? All righty. Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you for the time. Thank you for the questions.
We now have Ben Weinberg, who is joining us by Zoom. Mr. Weinberg, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good evening, commissioners, and thank you very much for having me on tonight. And I apologize for not being able to be there in person. My name is Ben Weinberg, and I'm the Director of Policy at Citizens Union, a good government group that has worked for over a century to ensure fair and open elections and honest and accountable government in both city and state governments. We appreciate the Commission's thoughtful work to strengthen oversight and accountability in city government and your two reports. Today, I'll highlight in brief a few of our top priorities, but I'm happy to answer any questions on any of the other issues. So first, on mayoral removal. We strongly support creating a process to remove a mayor for misconduct, and we thank the Commission for considering the hybrid model we proposed back in April. That begins with the City Council and ends with voters. It is tailored to New York's political structure and avoids the flaws of recall or impeachment systems that are used elsewhere. Our testimonies highlight several key elements, including the need to set substantial council supermajorities in this process, the importance of providing due process to the mayor, and providing transparency throughout the process. Second, conflicts of interest and the COIB budget. We support an independent budget for the Conflicts of Interest Board, but we recommend setting it at a higher level than the one proposed in the report. That figure, we believe, will simply restore past funding levels, more or less, to the kind of pre-cut levels, and doesn't really account for new responsibilities or long-term growth. Without a forward-looking approach, the board could remain again vulnerable for underfunding, similar to what we have seen with the CCRB and its minimum budget, another issue you tackled in your report. In addition, we support the following proposals in the report: the quorum proposal for the COIB, the proposals related to the Department of Investigation, budget and removal protections, as well as the CCRB policies on its budget and board structure. Third, on special elections for referenda. We oppose the proposal to allow local law referendums to be voted on in special elections. Special elections in New York City see extremely low voter turnout, and it's basically below 10%. Creating a new off-cycle, standalone election runs counter to a statewide trend we've seen of consolidating elections with higher turnout elections to improve participation. So we urge the Commission not to move this proposal forward, which we believe would weaken democratic engagement in the charter revision process rather than support it. Finally, on advice and consent, we at Citizens Union oppose a wholesale expansion of advice and consent for mayoral appointments. While we support strengthening the council's oversight role, as we have done for many years, we believe approval for all commissioners would significantly shift the balance of powers in city government and alter the strong mayoral form of government, which we at Citizens Union believe has generally served New York City well for decades. Past expansions of advice and consent have been gradual and tied to the unique nature of a specific role. We support continuing that case-by-case approach. We have endorsed advice and consent for the police commissioner for exactly that reason, but we believe expanding it to more than 30 roles at once would weaken the mayor's ultimate responsibility and accountability for managing agencies, policies, and programs, and would also present some practical challenges in terms of getting all of these commissioners approved early on during an administration. I thank you very much for giving me the time and for your work on this topic, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I'm going to ask the commissioners if they have any questions, but before they go, I just wanted one clarifying point before I turn over the microphone, and that was you mentioned that for advice and consent, you were in agreement around advice and consent for the police commissioner, and I didn't know if there were other roles as well, or if it was solely just that role.
So we have, because we at Citizens Union have researched and worked on police accountability issues for many years. This kind of grew out of our work around how to improve police accountability overall, discipline and oversight in the NYPD. And our recommendation on advice and consent for the police commissioner was kind of tied to that issue. We have not looked into advice and consent for other roles. Although we have weighed in the past when the Corp Council was up for advice and consent, and probably when the DOI commissioner was, although that was in 1989.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, please.
Thank you, Ben, for appearing today. I want to talk a little bit about advice and consent. In your testimony now, you raised the concern that expanding it all at once to all mayoral appointed agency heads would sort of weaken the power of the mayor. And I wanted to expand upon that. I want to understand why you think that's the case. Do you feel that that's not that's also the case on the federal and the state level, where at both for the executive branch in the federal government and the executive branch at the state level, there's a lot of advice and consent. It doesn't seem to inhibit or take away the power of the executive to staff the agencies with the people they want, and it doesn't really seem to weaken the authority of those commissioners once they're in office. So I want to understand what is different about doing it in New York City that would sort of weaken an executive when it doesn't seem to be the case at the state or federal level.
Thank you, Commissioner. We think that New York City commissioners have different responsibilities than their counterparts in state and federal government, even in some other cities, in the sense that they oversee agencies that directly and immediately impact residents' lives, policing, sanitation, housing, emergency response. In New York City specifically, they hold powers that sometimes in other areas around the country are done by the county. So that scope, that immediacy of the role, we think means that it is even more important that they be appointed and managed by the mayor, because the mayor is the only executive officer who is accountable to all voters. And even the city charter defines the mayor as the chief executive officer of the city. So the way we see it, under our kind of strong mayoral system, and the mayor is essentially the one responsible for the effective and accountable delivery of services. Now, if the mayor appoints, makes poor appointments, or their commissioners do not do a proper job, the voters have a chance to elect a different mayor, or just kind of make their election based on how they believe a mayor, the work they believe a mayor has done in terms of the appointments. In fact, we think kind of the current election cycle is basically an example of how the political consequences of executive leadership and appointments play out. So that is partly why we see both the difference in New York City and other state and federal officials, and why we think the mayor should still have control over their appointments.
I like that as a follow-up question. So that makes a lot of sense, but then you almost make the argument against creating advice and consent, or allowing advice and consent for the police commissioner, because I think there's no agency across city government that really touches the lives of everyday New Yorkers than the police department. And in some cases, it's the power to detain, and in some cases, it's the power of life and death. So why are you not concerned that the authority and accountability of the executive branch is going to be weakened by allowing advice and consent, let's say, for the police department, but it is going to weaken it for, let's say, if we allow advice and consent for DFTA or parks or DOT.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think the honest answer, we are concerned. So we acknowledge every time that advice and consent is expanded, that control, the kind of mayoral control over the performance of government is weakened to a certain extent. And that is why we do support a case-by-case evaluation related to or connected to the kind of nature of the position and its either powers or its role in the structure of government, and then making the case of whether that weakening of a mayoral power merits, or sorry, the expansion merits the weakening of the mayoral power. We, in the case of the police commissioner, have found that in our opinion, given the just extraordinary legal powers that the police commissioner holds, and just its sweeping impact on the rights of New Yorkers, and essentially the fact that the NYPD is militarized group, not in a negative sense. This is just their powers and authority. We believe it is important to have an extra check on that appointment. In the past, for example, for Corp Counsel, the argument was made that because the Corp Counsel represents both sides of City Hall, they should have this extra check. So I think, and about the police commissioner, people can argue otherwise. I think our point here is that there should be a case-by-case discussion over advice and consent to specific positions, rather than a wholesale expansion on all cabinet roles and commissioners, which would then indeed kind of shift the entire power away from the mayor.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the testimony. I wanted to follow up about the guaranteed funding for independent entities and oversight entities. So a few parts to my question. One is, with regards to the Conflicts of Interest Board, you testified that you thought the recommendation in our initial report was not enough. I'm curious if you have a specific amount that you would recommend that you do think is enough. And then beyond that, I'm curious if what you thought of the recommended percentages for the CCRB and for Department of Investigation. And then beyond that, what you thought about how our report sort of for some entities recommended a percentage and others had a more, I want to be neutral in how I say this, just a more general description saying, sufficient funding to fulfill operations, and what you thought of that approach to some of those oversight entities. Thanks.
Thank you. These are excellent questions, and the question of providing, securing independent or minimum budget is a really difficult one, and we've seen how previous reforms can play out. The Campaign Finance Board has this really helpful mechanism that essentially allows them to receive the amount they want every year without committing to a specific percentage, and has allowed them to carry out one of the probably most impressive programs we have in the country related to pro-democracy reform. But the CCRB, the CCRB budget, which fixed on a specific percentage of headcount, obviously was not enough. So all I'm saying is that this is not an easy, it's really hard to know how these things will play out. And I don't have an answer on whether, on what should be the right percentage for the Department of Investigation, although I'm happy to come back with more specific numbers. I think it will be interesting to hear from the commissioner as well on this. On the COIB, so the way we calculate the percentage included in the report, in the current executive budget, it would come out to about $3.45 million. And that is an increase from the current level. But if you look at the COIB budget from kind of pre-pandemic, more or less pre-pandemic years, you see this really only restores the inflation-adjusted funding for those pre-cut levels. So that is our concern. And again, we think that the COIB has already received more responsibilities, like on legal defense trusts, and there are several bills in the council now seeking to add more powers to the COIB. So we do believe it should be raised. Now, in terms of what is the exact amount, the commission proposed 0.0003, if I have my zeros correctly. If you turn it into a 4 or a 5, that would add a pretty, it's in terms of the number, I think it's if you add it to a 0.5, it's maybe $1 million extra, if I have my calculations correct. So I can come back with more specific numbers, and I believe the COIB might testify on this issue as well. But the point I'm making is that the difference between the 3, the 4, and the 5 is minor in the kind of, if you look at the city budget as a whole. These are hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe 1 million. And Commissioner, I forgot if there was another.
Yeah, there's one more part. So our preliminary recommendations have sort of different approaches to some of the oversight entities for minimum funding. And for some, there's a percentage recommendation. And for others, it just says something like sufficient to do their work. And I was curious what you thought of that approach to guaranteed minimum funding.
Thank you. I would not recommend including sufficient in the city charter unless so including something like sufficient only means that litigation can happen, and someone would have to sue if someone believes that there isn't sufficient funds, and then and then it really depends on the jurisprudence around that term and whether there's even interest to sue that and what are the current needs of that agency. So I think it will take a long time before an agency is properly funded. It will likely protect adding as kind of like a vague term like sufficient will likely protect from a wholesale cut, kind of defunding of an agency for political reasons, because that is very hard to justify. And I think a mayor who would try to do that would probably know that they have a good chance they will lose in court. But I don't know if that will bring that agency up to a current standard funding level. So it really depends on what the commissioner is attempting on doing for each of these agencies, whether it's just kind of protecting from politicized defunding or ensuring they have minimum standard amount. Again, the COIB is an example of an agency which, has kind of in the last few years they haven't received approval to hire new personnel. They were not gonna openly defunded, or their budget was not cut. They were just not allowed to get enough money to do their work. So I think if you are a future mayor trying to weaken and oversight agencies, there are probably ways to go around a kind of like quote unquote sufficient funding minimum requirement.
Thank you. Commissioner Rahul, I believe you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. Ben, thanks for your testimony. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I very much agree with your remarks regarding advice and consent. And I think you described it as sort of a list of all commissioner level appointments. The proposal that we've received is actually even sort of more sweeping than what you described. It's all commissioner level appointments plus every member of the PPB plus the director of OMB. So, in one fell swoop, the commission, the recommendation we received is essentially to sort of, subject this entire part of city government to advice and consent. I sort of agree with you that it's a problematic idea for a number of reasons. My question to you is with respect to mayoral removal powers, and in particular the sort of recall aspect of that. What is your response? It sounds like you've done a lot of research into this issue, and so I think probably this is one area that you've developed a lot of knowledge on. What is your response to the general sort of criticisms of recall elections, right? That they potentially politicize, can be used to weaponize the process, that they're really expensive, that they might cause mayors to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, and the things that they would do would be in the best interest of the city, but now they're subject to a potential recall. Like there's all these recall elections. I think you would agree are not divisive, but they're not sort of uniformly applauded. And so, what's your response to the criticisms of them?
Thank you, Commissioner. We see it. So we see a few drawbacks to the kind of traditional recall method that we have tried to address here. The first one is that there are too many opportunities for a recall question to get on the ballot, right? So in a way, the first is that it's just too easy to ask voters whether they want to recall because there's a low threshold in terms of signatures, or because, and this is what we often see, and this is one of the most common criticism, because we have special interests, very high funded, well-funded special interests that kind of drive the signature petition process. So our proposal basically removes the ability of voters to trigger the process. Only the city council can trigger the process, so that you kind of take away at least that part out of the equation. Then the second element is whether this process is politicized or not, and to what extent. We do believe that it is crucial to keep a process of this kind focused on misconduct, and not on policy differences or ideological differences or partisan differences. So that is why, whatever way is chosen, it's crucial to have clear grounds for removal, so that you can only start the process by voting or declaring or finding a mayor, charging a mayor with. We included 4 reasons: malfeasance, neglect of duty, violation of oath of office. So there's kind of there are different ways of building this, but certainly you have to have some legal grounds of removal that could be debated and possibly litigated if someone wants to just start a removal process for our political reasons. And then I think the third concern you raised was about how divisive it is, and how this could kind of even obstruct government or obstruct our politics in New York City. So that's why we do think this should be kept for exceptional circumstances. The way we think you keep it only in exceptional circumstances, you basically make it harder. You make the completing the entire process pretty difficult. So that's why we included substantial supermajorities. So you cannot have the kind of regular 2/3 majority, which we often see in the city council, veto-proof majority. And that we think there is eventually, if the city council wants to send a question to voters about removing a mayor, which let's call it divisive, and voters would reject that question, that would be very negative to the city council as well. So we don't think that this is kind of like a decision that the council would take haphazardly or without a lot of thinking, because of the political consequences that the council, the speaker, the members of the council could see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other comments? Did you have another question?
Again, thank you for your testimony. So I think the staff report has 5 different agencies or commissions that they recommend minimum funding for, and I think you endorsed one of them. And I guess my question is not any of the specifics, but what criteria would, one use to decide that there should be minimum funding for a commission or an agency? Yours overfunding could be is an underfunded one and vice versa. So if you're looking to an agency or commission, what criteria should we look at to sort of say that one should have minimum funding and that one shouldn't?
That's an excellent question. I will just say we support the conflicts of interest boards, independent budget, and the DOI one. The CCRB is already there, and we support the shift that is proposed. But there were other agencies there that we have personally have just not looked into. These are not agencies we kind of engage with or work on or research, although we are scheduled to have more internal discussions on this in Citizens Union, maybe would come back with more answers. But I think to your specific question, it's often a question of what's the risk of an agency being underfunded and whether a potential underfunding would have to do with just kind of overall policy choices related to how a mayor and a council decide to fund agencies more broadly, or whether it is a result of a conflict between the inherent role of that agency and the elected officials that fund it. So we have historically supported independent budgets for those government agencies and bodies that could be a victim, let's say, of underfunding because of political differences. The Campaign Finance Board is the best example of that. But obviously the ethics oversight agencies and the agencies that examine corruption are other ones. And, to be honest, board presidents and public advocate offices that now have minimum funding are other ones, not because of their inherent oversight role or power over the administration, but just because they are often staffed by political opponents of a mayor or maybe of a council, which would then decide to underfund them. And we've seen cases of that in the past. We've seen that in the public advocate's office, at the very least, in kind of early aughts. So for us, it's a question of that, the nature of the office and the risk the powers of the office would create in terms of underfunding, as well as just experience. If we've seen something like that in the past, and that's why the COIB for us is kind of the top of the list, because we have seen it being underfunded in the last few years.
Thank you. I believe we have one more question.
Thank you. This goes to back to mayoral removal. What are your thoughts on the 60-day timeframe that was in the preliminary report? Do you feel that's sufficient time for filing charges to holding a special election, given the issues with special elections? Do you think it should be more?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a give and take here for sure. When we thought about this and looked at other systems and really kind of debated this, we wanted to keep the disruption for city government at a minimum, especially since you could have, it's in our proposal, you would remove a mayor and then have the vacancy being filled by the public advocate calling for a special election. So, this is a serious disruption for city government, which we wanted to avoid. And that is why I believe our report said up to 30 days for the hearing at the city council, and if the city council finds that the mayor should be found kind of guilty, quote unquote, then a special removal election would be held in 30 days. So a total of about 60 days. It is true that, as I mentioned earlier, special elections are suffer from low voter turnout, and I think there is room there to include provisions that attach this kind of special removal election to an upcoming election, like there is now, right? If you call for an election, I forget the numbers, but let's say 85 days in advance of a primary, then it's, it happens at the same time with the primary or something like that. I think there's room to include some of those provisions that consolidate elections. But we think that in this specific case, this will likely trigger substantial and intense media attention, media coverage, and campaigns from both the mayor who is up for removal and other factions in city politics. So we believe it has a better chance of getting higher voter turnout than the regular special election.
Thank you, Mr. Weinberg, for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. I want to remind everyone that our next hearings are Tuesday, June 17th at Mind Builders Creative Arts Center in the Bronx, focusing on budget transparency. Monday, June 23rd at the Museum of the City of New York in Manhattan, focused on government accountability. Thursday, June 26th at Sunset Park Library in Brooklyn, focusing on land use. Tuesday, July 1st at Queens Public Library in Jamaica. As this is our final hearing, it will focus on any area in particular. All hearings are from 5 to 7, and folks are invited to testify either in person or via Zoom. Registration and further details on all hearings are on our website at www.thecommission.nyc. I want to thank everyone who testified today, watched online or in person, and the commission staff who organized this hearing. Are there any questions or other business from the commissioners before we adjourn? Any other questions? Okay. Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn? Motion, okay. All those in favor? Oh, I'm sorry. And can I have a second? Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the minute. We have a second. All those in favor? Okay. Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes and we are adjourned. Thank you so very much.